All right. Welcome everyone to the 5th Winter Streak workshop, Savor the Flavor with a Twist. We're excited to have you back. As always, if you would be kind enough, now that I've hit record, to put your first and last name in the chat. That is the way that we're able to track your attendance and make sure that you have an entry for the health and wellness swag baskets that we'll be giving away at the end of the 3-month period. And certainly as we go along, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and I'll make sure that we get those questions to Fran as she goes along. And having said that, I'm going to turn over the floor to my colleague, Fran Hadley, and let her introduce herself and get started. Take it away, Fran.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Welcome, everybody. I'm one of the registered dietitians in the Wellness Center over here in the Wellspring Ephrata Community Hospital. And part of my job is spent doing nutrition counseling with some of our outpatient clients in diabetes, as well as other types of non-diabetes related nutrition topics. And also we do speaking engagements such as this. We're hoping sometime we're going to be able to get back in person doing our health fairs and things like that. And I also am involved as a diabetes educator with our diabetes program as well. So, all right. All right, next slide, please. All right, so as you all saw, our title of our program today is Savor the Flavor with a Twist, and we're talking about how we can use some healthier ingredients to lighten up some of our favorite comfort foods. Next slide, please. And the two objectives that we're going to try to go through today, where are you going? There you go. Identify 3 strategies that will help to fuel your body, and while also satisfying your comfort food cravings. And number 2 is identifying 3 tips. I'm sorry, I can't see on that slide there. Hold on 1 second. Identify 3 tips to curb your winter food cravings. Next slide, please. All right, and we're thinking, next slide. Oh. There you go. Kim, I know you told me it's like a lag, so I have to remember to be patient.
Yeah, yep. There's a little bit of a lag between when you say next slide and when I can get the slide to advance. So thanks.
Okay, no problem. Thanks
for the patience. Yeah.
Yeah. So why are we craving food during the winter time? Of course, you know, now Kim's talking about it's almost spring around the corner, but when the temperatures were a lot colder and the days were a lot longer and we were, you know, going to work in the dark and coming home in the dark. Now it's nice to be able to have some daylight. But, you know, during that time, our body temperature changes and that really drops. And that's where the tendency for those cravings sometimes can occur, because we want something warm to quickly warm up our body temperature as well. So sometimes those cravings get pretty intense. And then that kind of sets up the cycle and we just keep eating, you know, that appetite is in motion and we want a lot of those comfort food goodies that we're all craving, especially during that time, like a lot of the starchy carbs, lots with high calorie, high fat, high sugary, and that makes our blood sugars fluctuate as well. So it really can make our appetite send it into overload as well. So some tips just to kind of think about during you know, your times when you are craving. First of all, acknowledging that you are having these cravings, thinking about eating with attention. So focusing on the plate. You know, what about the variety that's there? What about color? You know, especially in the wintertime, we think a lot about, you know, the dreariness that we're seeing outside. So we want foods that are going to make, you know, have some eye appeal as well. We want to think about the aroma or the smells that are on that plate. You know, think about how you would have prepared some of those items. So that also will help to, you know, keep us kind of focused. I'm always a big proponent of really trying to help clients that I meet to stay on track with trying to space meals, maybe no longer than 4 or 5 hours apart. So really trying to schedule, you know, eating within, you know, regular intervals so that you avoid the tendency to overeat because you missed a meal or you just waited too long. And by that time, the hunger is in full force and it's a lot harder to kind of control that at that point. So really just trying to, you know, even if it's a smaller type of meal choice or a smaller snack choice, Think about what your snack choices are. You know, some of us need a little bit of pick-me-up during the day. Maybe we might need a little bit of something in the evening, but again, we want to think about providing some type of protein with that snack. It could be a meat source or, you know, a dairy. It could be nuts, along with maybe some higher fiber type of carbohydrate. You know, perhaps it could be, you know, a grain or a fruit. Could be a dairy product as well. Could even be those, you know, vegetables. And choosing slower carbs. You know, when we're eating, you know, a lot of, especially certain types of grains like oats and barley, quinoa, if you like any of those, some of your whole grains, as well as some vegetables, asparagus, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, carrots, legumes, you know, beans and lentils. I don't know how many of you like to incorporate those, but they really do help to break down slower. So they help by also not making our blood sugar spike. So especially for people with diabetes or prediabetes, those are really great types of healthy carbs to incorporate daily. And they will help to satisfy your hunger a lot longer because they take longer to break down and keep you satisfied for a longer period of time. Indulging mindfully. You know, sometimes we're mindless eaters, so we don't think about, oh my gosh, I just ate like 5 of those little Hershey Kisses without even thinking about it. So again, just bringing that to the forefront. How many of you have ever eaten a Hershey Kiss using like a mindful eating test, where you actually look at it, you unwrap it very slowly? How many of you can pop it in your mouth and keep it just melting in your mouth? How long does it take you to do that? So, you know, rather than chomp and it's done and we're in for another bite as well. So sometimes just thinking a little bit more about being more mindful about, you know, savoring the flavor with those. And we've already addressed, you know, the importance of staying hydrated, especially during this time of the year, and staying active. Next slide. Okay, bringing out the flavors. So when we're thinking about some of our seasonings that we might be using, or laying down, you know, some of the types of flavors that we can incorporate to cut the fat, cut the salt, cut the extra sugar, perhaps in some of our recipes. We want to think about some of those types of ingredients that we might be using in our comfort food recipes. We want something that has, you know, some heart health benefits also. So I put on the top here turmeric. I don't know how many of you might be using that or like to use that type of spice, but it's the curcumin compound, and it does have some anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties with it. It's kind of got a mustardy type of profile, so it's that yellow that gives, you know, the yellowish color to like your eggs. Goes great in soups and stews. You can sprinkle a little bit on popcorn. You can include it also in hummus. So even if you bought like the classic hummus or even like a garlic, you can put a little bit of that spice in there. So it's just bringing out a whole different type of boldness to a healthier snack choice. Fruit juices, how do we flavor without salt? We could use fruit juices in a marinade. We can use it as to deglaze. We're doing something on a stovetop and we're making something, we might add a little bit of cornstarch perhaps, and we're making some type of a glaze and deglazing that. So you have a little bit of a flavor, not necessarily that's full of a lot of sodium. Jams, preserves, you know, even a little bit of honey or maple syrup sometimes can go a long way to really, you know, give a different flavor of some type of a recipe. And brown sugar is something that actually does go well in rubs. I've seen a lot of recipes that they use brown sugar, you know, as a seasoning or as a flavorful rub. So another, you know, way that you can enhance the flavor of like a dry meat, you're baking chicken or grilling chicken or a beef or a steak, perhaps. Next slide. Not sure how many of you use different types of vinegars, and down at the bottom of that is also like the sesame oil or the herb infused types of oils. I don't know how many are familiar with like the Oleo place in Lidditz, and there's lots of other places around our county, and I'm sure where Kim lives as well out there, and some of the other counties where everybody's coming from. There's lots of these different varieties in these specialty shops that really are great choices to incorporate like in veggie dishes, soups, stews, in your main dishes, using as marinades, even like sprinkling, you know, drizzling a little bit on fruit, for example, you know, depending on what that flavor of vinegar is, or even the oil. So thinking about how we can use some of those other ingredients just to bring out different types of flavors and make it a little bit more bold. We might want a little bit of zip by using some citrus. That certainly can kind of lighten up some of those recipes. Maybe adding it again to a soup. When I think of like a zest, whether it's a lime or a lemon or an orange, I think particularly of also like lemon juice. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the dish tabbouleh, which is a Middle Eastern dish. And typically it's made, I think, with bulgur. I use farro in place of bulgur oftentimes, but it's got a lot of lemon juice, olive oil, lots of different other vegetables that are in that green salad. So it just brings out a nice, really, healthy, kind of a clean type of feeling, taste in your mouth when you're doing some of that citrus. Heat up some of those dishes with, some hot spices. If you like some cayenne pepper, or you might like some hot peppers in your recipes, to give it a little bit more of a heat. Plain yogurt works really well in a marinade, and also helps to tenderize a meat. And, when that's also cooking, it's caramelizing a little bit different than like an oil that would have been on a meat. And I already talked about, some of those different oil infused oils, the vinegars that are out there. Next slide. There we go. Switching up the ingredients. So I don't know how many of you kind of look at some of your recipes and think, geez, how can I make this a little bit healthier? So we might think about ways that we could consider like similar taste and textures when we're replacing ingredients. I put a few up here. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I also will make sure that Kim sends out a link for you for some recipes that I put together, kind of featuring some of those different ingredients that you can use in some of the recipes. But first of all, we're thinking about heart health. So we always want to try to focus our attention on getting more of our fats from healthy fats like avocados, nuts, and seeds, and also oils, for example. So besides we're getting, maybe we like fish like salmon or tuna, some of the heart healthy omega-3s. So really trying to incorporate some of that in some of our dishes. We might use avocados as fat replacer in some of our recipes. And you can use like a 1-to-1 ratio. You could use like a cup of avocados in place of a cup of butter in a recipe. You could try out maybe even like half it, just to see, how you like the taste. Oftentimes you're not going to be able to taste that so much like in a baked good, for example, item. Nuts, I don't know, sometimes we like to coat our meats or our vegetables with breadcrumbs. Why not try, grinding up or chopping up maybe pistachios or some walnuts. I don't know how many of you use like the panko breadcrumbs, but they do have like a whole grain variety. And because they're bigger, you don't need to use a lot of them. You can mix in some nuts with that. You can put some spice or like some Parm cheese in it, and then coat your vegetables or a meat. So just again, brings out a whole different type of flavor or taste to that particular item. Low-fat dairy, many of you might already be using maybe plain Greek yogurt in some of your recipes. You can use it definitely, in dips or sauces, usually replacing either half or all of it with, that as opposed to a mayo. If you're using it in a hot dish, you do have to kind of add it at the end of the dish because it will curdle. So you do have to be aware of that. But Greek yogurt, also if it's just the plain whole, I don't necessarily with that one, I wouldn't always think you have to use the fat-free, but you could use the plain. And like 1 cup of the Greek yogurt, if you do use something that's fat-free, it's only like 120 calories versus a cup of sour cream, which is about almost close to 500 calories and a lot more fat. So if you're using it in some of your recipes, Greek yogurt can also be used in like a brownie recipe or some types of other cake recipes in place of sour cream. So think a little bit about ways that you can use that in some of those types of recipes, perhaps. Biscuits, potatoes, I think of shepherd's pie, some of those types of comfort foods, or perhaps maybe chicken and waffles, or chicken a la king, or some of the other, really nice, comforting, warm dishes that we like to have, especially at this time of the year. So what other bases could we use in place of like the biscuits or potatoes? We could use brown rice, You can use some whole grain pasta. We could use some mash up some red skin potatoes, keep the skin on it, so you're also getting some fiber. Beans are another great way to incorporate in some of your recipes. I don't know how many of you are bean lovers in the group, but oftentimes you can use it, particularly because it has a creamy type of consistency to it. So it's really a good thickener that you can use in place of heavy cream, or even like instead of using like a roux or something with flour and milk added to it. So it's a nice way you can mash up some of the beans or puree some of them. And as that soup, especially is in particular is cooking, it's also going to thicken along the way. So you're saving yourself a lot of fat calories in that particular situation. You can use the no salt added canned beans. So for those of you who might be watching your sodium intake, that certainly is a great way to incorporate something in place of the cream. You could substitute a half cup of pureed beans for a half cup of cream in a recipe, just to kind of give you an idea, as a start. And then winter squash. This is, another item that's certainly plentiful, especially in the fall and winter time. And I don't know how many of you know this, but winter squash is also pretty low carbohydrate compared to regular pasta or rice. So like a cup of cooked squash is only about maybe 50 calories, maybe 60 calories, versus a cup of cooked pasta is about 240. So it's certainly a savings when we're talking about ways that we can lower the carbohydrate, not necessarily cut it out, but using some of those in place. So spaghetti squash can replace fettuccine noodles, like in an Alfredo. You can make a modified cream sauce there and save, a lot of different, a lot of calories just from the standpoint from the fat. Also in baked goods, you can use like pumpkin. Many of us might use applesauce, or we might use like dried prunes, pureed prunes, or we might use mashed bananas in place of fat, but you can also use canned pumpkin. So you're, again, adding a nice vitamin A source, to that recipe. And I don't know that you're necessarily going to know that it's in there, but it's a good way to replace some of the fat. You can also replace pumpkin for egg in a recipe. So a quarter of a cup per egg, and the same amount, quarter of a cup, would be replacing a quarter cup of oil, like in a recipe. So it depends on, what you're using in a baked good recipe, but another way that you can just, make it a little healthier variety as far as that. And then spiralized vegetables, there's lots of those that are out on the market today, that we can, you don't always have to take the time to prepare all of those. They do have a lot of those convenience ones already in the produce section for you. Next slide. And then giving it texture. And we can think about a lot of different ways, how we're incorporating vegetables, particularly vegetables, in our daily diets. There was just some information again out on the news that we're still falling short as a country in getting our, at least 2.5 to 3 cups of vegetables servings per day for most adults. So how do we go about just trying to change some of that when we're talking about some of our comfort foods? So take a typical grilled cheese sandwich. You could, add apple slices to it. You could change up the cheese and maybe use something with a little bit more bold taste. And you may not use as much of that because you're filling up that sandwich with some other items. You could do, some peppers like red peppers, or even like roasted peppers, some onion slices, some tomato. So again, it's a way that we sometimes will refer to making something more nutrient dense instead of calorie dense. So a lot less fat, or in some cases, a lot less salt or sugar, depending on what that recipe is. Taking a grain salad, or a grain pasta, or a legume-based salad, for example, and again, just adding more of those vegetables to have less calories overall, less carbohydrate. Again, if you wanted to reduce that a little bit. How many of you have ever used maybe mushrooms in like making hamburgers or meatloaf? Anybody? I found a recipe, I don't know, it was probably last summer, and it really changed the taste of that burger. It really was very juicy. So you can take a pound of meat, pound of ground hamburger. You could use ground turkey, lean turkey if you choose to do that, and take about an 8 ounce, the smaller box of the mushrooms, chop them up. You'd be surprised at how savory and how moist that burger is. So just, again, changes the whole taste. If you have some picky eaters in your family, good ways to hide some of those vegetables or grated carrots and things like that you can put into meatballs or meatloaf or other types of dishes where they're still getting some nutrients, but they're just not tasting them. Nachos, I also put on here. I think of that as a real comfort food. So what's traditional, nachos look like? Lots of cheese and meat, lots of those tortilla chips, and lots of maybe onions or olives, whatever goes on it. But certainly not a low calorie dish by any means. You can use cauliflower. Some people really like using cauliflower today in lots of different ways. So you would use that in place of those tortilla chips, maybe sprinkle or crinkle or chop up, or not chop up, kind of crumble some of those tortilla chips on the top. I am including, as I said, a recipe handout for you that they'll send out to you within the week. And the one that I chose was actually something using sweet potatoes and cutting them like coins, almost like, those crinkled type of carrots. And then maybe a little bit of those tortilla chips like sprinkled on top, but lots of vegetables, a lot lower in calories and fat content and sodium as well. I also included other root vegetables. So what in the world does that mean besides potatoes? We think of potatoes, white potatoes, as French fries. We think of sweet potatoes as French fries. How many of us have ever thought of even like a rutabaga or even like a jicama, which is the Mexican potato? I actually saw those this weekend, lots of them at Weiss. I shop in Ephrata. And it's got a hard brown skin on it, but the inside is very kind of like creamy white. And it tastes a lot like a turnip or a potato, but it's actually much lower in carbohydrate. So a cup of that only has maybe 40 to 50 calories per cup and only about 11 grams of carbohydrate. Whereas if I'm eating a cup of potatoes, that's about from a carb standpoint, about 30 grams. So again, another way that you can try something new. It might give you a little bit of that satisfaction from the craving, but maybe a different, healthier twist to it. Next slide. Okay. And I did talk a little bit briefly about just using beans as a thickener with soups. So again, finding ways that you can incorporate some, veggies, trying to put more vegetables, swapping out some of that. I'm just making it a little bit of healthier variety. With shepherd's pie, I think of that also as a comfort food, especially during the winter time. Instead of mashed potatoes, we could use mashed sweet potatoes. You could make a mashed cauliflower. You can even add some beans in part of your meat. So replacing some of the meat in the recipe with some beans. So you're also adding, again, some more fiber and lots more nutrients and replacing some of that animal source of protein with a veggie source. Next slide. And changing the presentation. So why would that be important? Sometimes we might say, well, we would have a burrito or we could have a grain bowl. So you're just changing the presentation. The picture here that you see is a zucchini enchilada, which you will be getting the recipe for that. So it totally changes the whole, the way it's being presented to you. A lot less calories. You're using, some low carb vegetables and maybe not as much of the meat in that particular recipe. So you could even do, instead of a grilled cheese sandwich, do like a grilled cheese soup. There's lots of different ways that you can change the presentation of a particular recipe. Next slide. And downsizing. This is, if we really want that nice comfort food, but we're not willing to maybe sacrifice making some changes to the recipe, we could downsize by, maybe like sliders. So you're using smaller rolls. Maybe you can, do something that's a little high fiber. Muffin tin recipes. I encourage a lot of my patients to look into those types of ideas. We have some recipes that we oftentimes will hand out to some of our folks. But again, a baked oatmeal, which is tons of fat and tons of sugar, by putting it in a muffin tin, you are cutting those calories significantly and still getting, the flavor that you want. Even like taking a pasta and using those small ramekins. that you can cook it in. So again, downsizing, the portion, which is going to cut everything significantly. So you can still, not necessarily sacrifice the taste, but still have something that you enjoy, but a smaller portion. Next slide. And last, just to kind of, think about, I like to always encourage patients and my clients to think about, stepping out of the box. We really know the importance and the benefits of eating plant-based foods. It doesn't have to be something like tofu that you don't know how to cook it, or it doesn't look like anything like a piece of juicy steak. But like sloppy joes, I've made already with lentils. If I decided I didn't want to, I wanted to put a little burger in there, I could do that. But lentils are a great legume that's, you don't need to soak it. You can just use them as they are. So you're getting a really nice high fiber. You can add some grain to that, like either a brown rice. You can put some bulgur in there, it's a nice other healthy type of a grain. Nutritional yeast. I don't know how many of you are on today from Ephrata area, but we were doing the healthy day in the park at the library here in Ephrata a few years. And one of our jobs, our boss said, can you make some popcorn toppings? So we decided to look into that, and we found actually one using nutritional yeast. It's a very popular item that's used often in vegetarian and vegan diets, but it does taste like cheese, and it is actually a complete protein. So it can be substituted in place of regular cheese in a recipe. You can sprinkle it on popcorn. You can use it in any recipes that uses cheese. So I thought I would add that there. Comes in bulk. I don't think it's too terribly expensive. You don't use a lot of it at one time, but again, rather than using regular cheese, which has a lot of saturated fat and calories, you might go with something else. Veggie burgers, the sky's the limit with that as well. So again, just thinking a little bit more about plant-based in your diet and maybe substituting, maybe one meatless dish a week, not just marinara sauce with spaghetti, but trying to incorporate maybe some other alternatives there. So, with that said, I gave you, some ideas, some of the recipes that I will be sending to you. I tried to kind of think about some of the things that I talked about today, where you can, use some of those types of ingredients in a different way, just to bring out a better taste and hopefully still savor the flavor of those comfort foods that we all really enjoy.
Thank you, Fran.
Thank you very much.
Certainly open to take questions before we close. Just a reminder, if you have not already put your first and last name in the chat, please do so now. It is how we track attendance and make sure you have that entry for the prize baskets at the end of the program. Also wanted to make you aware that starting in roughly 2 weeks, we will have our 6-week series Get Healthy Now starting either in the evening on the 14th or during lunchtime on the 18th. Those classes do go for 6 weeks. We take a much deeper dive into a lot of the topics that you've heard over the course of Winter Streak. So you can go to winterstreak.org, not only for more resources in general, but also if you scroll about halfway down, you can sign up for the Get Healthy Now classes starting in a couple of weeks. And I'm just going to pull up the chat. We had, yes, and I will make sure, as always, you guys get a copy of the recording and a copy of the handout that Fran is preparing. Those two things may come separately, they may come together, but you will get them. And there's some great conversations going on in the chat, Fran, about what folks are doing in their own worlds. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. What they're doing in their own worlds in terms of substitutions or recipes that they're using, and everyone's looking forward to receiving your recipes. But I'll open up the floor if anyone has any questions for Fran while we've got her, and a reminder that we'll be back at 5:30 as well. Any questions for Fran? Well, with that, I will thank you all for attending. Thank you, Fran, for a fantastic presentation. I look forward to this evening. And again, be on the lookout for the emails with the recordings and the recipes. And we will see you at the very least in a couple of weeks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kim.